Hi, I'm Fernando. Welcome back to the Semaphore channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into a very important topic. When is it not a good idea to go with microservices? If you're building with microservices or you're thinking about making the shift into them, then stick around because I'm going to be covering some of the most common problems with microservices and also the fact that maybe in some cases monoliths are not such a bad idea. So let's go. So the first problem is jumping into microservices from the get-go without proper planning, essentially. Martin Fowler, the creator of REST and many other acronyms that we use on a daily basis, had to say this about the fact of jumping into microservices without really having a need for it. Almost all successful stories started as a monolith that grew too much and had to be split up into microservices. Almost all the cases where the system was built as a microservice from scratch ended up in some sort of trouble. And essentially, this pattern has led to many people arguing that microservices shouldn't be a pattern that you use at the start of your project just because, but rather the inevitable evolution of the monolith architecture once it's actually reached its limits. And if you think about it, that makes total sense. When you're doing something from scratch, when you're building a new product, usually what happens is that your first design is not really optimized. Because to optimize something, you have to actually have tried it before. You have to understand how people use the product, what kind of traffic it gets, how the resources are coping with that amount of traffic. There are many angles that could be optimized when it comes to the product. So if you're trying to optimize from the get-go, what happens is that you make a set of assumptions that if some of them don't really end up being true, then you have to start pivoting and you have to start making new assumptions. The problem is that when you create a big platform around microservices, you box yourself into a architectural pattern that maybe wasn't right for you. So that's why it is a common mistake to just jump into this pattern when you haven't really the need for it, instead of just starting with something that is simpler from the architectural point of view and then evolving it to the point that maybe it gets to a set of microservices or maybe it doesn't. Now, the second point is related to the previous one, essentially betting on microservices instead of betting in agility. Now, what does that mean? It means that when you're, especially in the scenarios where you're an early stage startup or you're building something of a greenfield product, which means there is nothing really out there that does the same thing that you do. There is not really any metric that you can follow or any code base or anything essentially that you can reuse. You're creating something from scratch altogether. In both these scenarios, what you should be aiming for is agility in your product, meaning you should be able to pivot fast enough in your technical decisions based on the immediate feedback that you get. Now, if you jump into microservices from the get-go, again, like I said before, you're boxing yourself into architectural decisions that could or could not allow for that agility. Usually what happens is that once your product starts to reach other people, they will inform you through their usage habits, through their direct feedback, or even through error logs. There are many ways in which you get feedback about how people are using your product, what kind of pain points they get. And those are the pain points that you should be aiming to fix or solve as quick as possible through your technology decisions, through your architectural decisions, or through improving or fixing features. But if the minute you go into microservices, you box yourself into that pattern and the implications of that pattern with the downsides as well. So remember that microservices are not just all pros for your product. There are cons to the approach. So before you marry with that approach, before you accept those cons, consider the alternatives and consider what you're trying to get: speed, flexibility at this early stage. Now, CI/CD pipelines are sometimes something that we take for granted. We always assume that for any project that we're going to build, they're always going to be there. But there are scenarios where you don't really have control over how the product gets deployed. All you have control is the code, and then you push the code and forget about it because your client will be the one owning that deployment. And what if they don't have a CI/CD pipeline? What if they don't really have a process, an automated process to deploy this? Then by making use of microservices, you're essentially forcing or adding a lot of failure points to that process. Instead of they having to just copy and or deploy essentially a single artifact, which would be your entire monolith, your entire application, you're now forcing them to manually deploy a set of services that need to interconnect with each other, that need to know a lot of things. And not only that, but also that are much harder to debug because you don't have a centralized way to do it. Their log files are much harder to maintain and manage essentially. And there are a lot of other like low-level implications that usually through automation we don't even think about them. But if that automation is not available, then they become a huge problem when maybe they shouldn't be, because all you needed was a monolith. Now, thinking that by definition your monolith is a death sentence to your app is the wrong approach, essentially. Monoliths are not intrinsically bad and are not intrinsically incapable of scaling, of performing well. They just have the tendency to be harder to scale. They have the tendency to generate coupling between different sections of the code. But that doesn't mean that they will cause that automatically. There is also a set of developers working on the project that need to make sure that they follow proper development practices to avoid those. If they don't, then yes, definitely monolith make it very easy to go wrong, especially in the mid to late stages of a product, because the code base or the business logic essentially is complex enough that it's very easy to start losing performance. That said, there are solutions to this problem. In fact, for example, Shopify has the largest Rails monolith with more than 3 million lines of code, and they're doing pretty fine. Why is that? Because they chose to modularize their code base, essentially. So essentially, the modularization is a step required when you're going with microservices. You have to split up your logic, your code base, essentially, into different modules. That said, you can stop there before you actually physically split the code, and you have what is called a modular monolith, essentially. That gives you many of the benefits of using microservices, such as decoupled code, such as teams being able to work on different sections of the code base without affecting each other. And on top of that, you actually gain something that with microservices you lose: a fast in-memory communication between modules. When you have microservices, the communication between those services has to happen over the network, essentially. There are many ways to do it, but the information needs to travel from one physical location to the other. In the case here of a modular monolith, the communication is done directly in memory between different modules. It's much faster and easy to manage that aspect of it. In other words, essentially, through a modularized monolith, you get many of the benefits of microservices without their downsides, such as like data aggregation in different databases, one for each service, improved inter-service communication, like I just mentioned. The debugging complexity is far lower because you just have a single process running everything and working with everything. And finally, troubleshooting problems in general, it's a lot easier because you don't have a split logic that you have to track data through different services or anything. You just have a single monolith that you can even debug, add breakpoints to it, and work with it in a very straightforward way. Now, another common mistake that's again related to the previous one is thinking that your monolith can scale just because it's a monolith. There's a lot of information around that will paint monoliths as the evil child essentially of software architecture that is implicitly incapable of scaling. And that is not necessarily true. In fact, in 2021, again, Shopify showed that their Monolith Rails application was able to handle an incredible amount of traffic with proper software development practices, with proper testing prior to that date, to those dates, with the tools required in place to make sure that the actual monolith could scale and had enough resources and had enough bandwidth to deal with that amount of information. Just like with microservices, technology stack decisions are just as important. Deploying, for example, deploying multiple versions of the monolith, putting them behind a load balancer, that works just like with microservices. Now, relying on CDNs, for example, to deliver static assets like style sheets, like images, like even JavaScript code, that is also a great way to offload traffic from your platform into a specialized platform that is well suited to serve that kind of content. And finally, using cache for your requests, even to handle DB queries, database queries. It's a very smart way to reduce traffic on different sections of to reduce load essentially on different sections of the system, including storage, data storage, for preventing it from becoming the bottleneck. When you have your system performing well and then suddenly it's performing so well that it's sending too many requests to a database. Adding a caching layer there will allow you to improve the performance of the storage layer as well. And this is a very valid solution without you having to break up your monolith into a set of microservices. Another very common issue is to just jump into microservices because it's the trend. It's where every big player is going to for some reason, and then you think, well, if it's good for them, then it's definitely going to be good for me. And that's not how these things work actually. Just because it's good for them, being huge industry players that have millions of users every day, that have been improving their systems for years, they're not exactly the same or in the same place that you are when you're just starting your project from scratch and you have essentially no user base and no traffic. You're just jumping into an architectural pattern that will increase the amount of maintenance, the amount of orchestration and automation that you need, instead of, again, allowing you to quickly pivot and quickly make changes without having to deal with all that extra work. Essentially, microservices tend to be a lot more work at the beginning of a project than they are at a later stage. But once your product is complex enough, and once you have the actual need to split it into multiple services, then at that stage, the benefits definitely outweigh the problems that the pattern brings. However, at the start, you don't get any of the benefits, you just get all the problems. Now, with that said, remember to plan ahead, monitor your system, monitor the performance, monitor all the metrics that you can around how the user base is working with it, how your product behaves, the performance, the resource utilization. Monitor everything. The minute you start seeing the pattern of resource consumption going up and user base going up and your performance degrading over time, then it might be a good idea to start thinking about the potential solutions, one of them including splitting into microservices. But don't wait until it's too late, and you definitely have to, because there is no other way. Essentially, be mindful, not at the start, but don't wait until the end either. Now, one of the reasons why going with microservices I've heard about is also like reducing the effect on Brooke's law. Brooke's law essentially states that um, adding manpower into an already late project, it's going to delay it even more. The reason for that is that you have an already complex code base, and onboarding new people into that code base is going to take you progressively longer time, because it's just the complexity keeps growing. Microservices are seen as a way to reduce that complexity by splitting the code base into manageable chunks, essentially, thus making it a lot easier for you to onboard people into their own service without having to really think or know about the rest of the project. Now, yes, that works. That is definitely a potential way to break that effect. However, it shouldn't be the reason why you're switching into microservices. If you are dealing with the problem that onboarding takes progressively longer, then there are potentially more ways to solve this than switching your entire architectural decisions into microservices. Again, adding a ton of problems on your plate that may actually be worse than your onboarding issues that you have right now. Also think about, if you're dealing with a project that is late already, making such a big architectural change will not make things go faster. In fact, you will have to go through an adjustment period for your team and the entire system to settle and stabilize itself into a working microservice architecture. So it will add a ton of time into your already delayed timeline. So really don't use microservices to solve this problem. Solve it some other way. Now, the question is, are you ready to go with microservices? And before you decide that, just answer some of these questions about your product and your team, because they both need to be primed for microservices. Do you have, or are you planning on having CI/CD automation pipelines ready? Do you have a quick way to provision infrastructure for your platform? Either just setting the basic infrastructure or even setting up automated scale up and scale down rules. Do you have cloud native experts in your team? Do you know how to deal with containers, with Kubernetes, with that sort of technology? Do you know what domain driven design, test driven design, or even behavior driven design are, and how to get the most out of those? Do you have a strong DevOps culture in your organization? Those are all questions that you need to answer yes to, all of them, before you actually think about switching into microservices. Those are all dependencies that you will have when making the switch, when thinking about deployment, when thinking about how to split your monolith. These are all related to either the technology you're using, the team that you have, or the actual product that you have and the business logic. If you don't answer yes to all these questions, then think about solving and getting ready on that aspect, and then go back to thinking about microservices. In the end, we can summarize the whole discussion about transitioning from monoliths to microservices with just one sentence: don't do it unless it's a good reason. It might be too obvious, but like I've been saying throughout the entire video, there are way too many reasons why people jump into microservices, and those are the wrong reasons to do it. So think about the fact that companies that usually make the jump or even start the journey into microservices without being technically prepared, without having their teams ready to go with microservices, or even without having a proper need on their product to go with microservices, usually will have a very bad time in the process. In the meantime, just think, why would I need to make the switch if my system is properly performing right now and I have the tools to scale it up without having to go through such a complex process of splitting it into microservices? If you're just starting with a project, focus more on that flexibility that we talked about, and focus on providing the features that your users need before trying to solve a problem you don't have and that will not provide any actual or meaningful benefits to your user base. That's it for now. That's the video. Just remember to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this in the future. See you later. Bye.